Picture the bustling streets of ancient Rome in 67 AD, where the grandeur of the empire is on full display. The Colosseum's shadow looms over the city, while the cries of vendors and chatter of busy citizens fill the air. But in the midst of this everyday life, something truly chilling unfolds. Nero, the emperor of Rome, walks through the forum, accompanied by a stunning figure at his side. She is draped in rich silks, adorned with jewels that shimmer in the daylight. Her grace and beauty are so striking that passers-by stare in awe, wondering who this new woman at the emperor's side might be. But the truth is far darker than anyone could imagine. This woman isn't a woman at all, but a boy once, a young man named Sporus. Nero, in his overwhelming grief for the loss of his wife Poppia, has twisted his obsession into something horrific. What the people of Rome see as a beautiful new empress is, in reality, the tragic result of a psychological and physical transformation forced upon Sporus, a boy from the emperor's household who bore an uncanny resemblance to the deceased empress. What Nero did to him is not just a tale of Roman excess, it is a story of madness, obsession, and cruelty. As the emperor strolls, no one dares to question what they see, for in the Roman Empire, to speak against the emperor is a death sentence. The whispers begin, but only behind closed doors, where the truth of what Nero has done is kept hidden in the shadows, just out of sight from the public eye. The transformation of Sporus into Poppia's replacement isn't simply a bizarre act, it's a deeply disturbing moment in history, where absolute power twists love into obsession, grief into madness, and a living human being into nothing more than a doll for the emperor's twisted fantasies. Nero's early reign, when he first ascended to the throne at just 16, held great promise. The Romans, weary of the oppressive rule of previous emperors, looked to Nero as a beacon of hope, a young leader who could bring a golden age to their empire. His early actions seemed to prove them right. He reduced taxes, funded grand public games, and even performed in theatrical productions, captivating the common people with his charm and charisma. Nero appeared to be the ideal ruler, one who balanced his imperial duties with a deep concern for the welfare of his people. But as history has often shown, power has a corrupting influence, and the young emperor began to change. The paranoia that comes with ruling an empire as vast as Rome slowly crept into Nero's mind. His once promising reign began to buckle under the weight of his growing isolation. For Nero, being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, meant that his worldview became increasingly warped. He became convinced that everyone around him was plotting to steal his power, and the paranoia grew into an obsession. Yet, it wasn't just the fear of losing power that altered Nero. It was the isolation. Imagine living in a world where no one can speak freely with you, where the constant whispers of sycophants drown out any hint of genuine advice or truth. The deeper Nero sank into this isolation, the further removed he became from reality. And it was this emotional and psychological unraveling that set the stage for the dark events to come. At the heart of this unraveling was a woman named Poppia. She wasn't just another wife or concubine. She represented everything Nero wanted in a partner: beauty, intelligence, and ambition. Poppia was the embodiment of Nero's grand vision, and he became utterly consumed by her presence. But Poppia was no simple figure in the imperial court. She was a formidable woman, capable of shaping events with a sharp political mind. Where Nero's first wife Octavia had been reserved and demure, Poppia was vivacious, commanding attention wherever she went. Their affair, which began as a typical Roman scandal, soon spiraled into an all-consuming obsession for Nero. He was no longer simply in love with her, he was addicted to the power she held over him. Nero lavished her with gifts, constantly showering her with jewels from distant lands, silks, perfumes, and more. But these lavish displays of affection were not merely gifts, they were signs of his growing obsession. Nero began to reshape reality itself to fit his desire. He divorced Octavia, his first wife, and announced plans to marry Poppia in a grand imperial ceremony. The spectacle was not just a wedding, it was an outward display of Nero's complete devotion to Poppia, an act that alienated many within the Roman elite. But even this extravagant display wasn't enough to satisfy Nero. His obsession with Poppia soon grew into something darker. He isolated her from family and friends, encircled her with people who owed their position to his favor, and demanded that she live entirely for him. It was at this point that Nero's mind truly began to break. He wasn't simply in love, he was possessed, and Poppia, intelligent as she was, realized this. She knew the dangerous game she was playing. She began to use her newfound power, playing Nero's affections to her family's advantage, creating alliances that could protect her should his obsession turn to violence. But the inevitable happened. Poppia had one fatal flaw: she was unafraid to challenge Nero. She wasn't afraid to criticize him, even publicly. She questioned his decisions, mocked his artistic pursuits, and, worst of all, she criticized his performance in the arts, a passion Nero held above all else. This challenge to his ego would be the spark that set Nero's dark path into motion. It's difficult to comprehend the emotional and psychological strain that must have weighed on Nero during this time. His relationship with Poppia had become a volatile mix of obsession and possessiveness, and no one in the court dared to challenge him. Yet Poppia's defiance proved to be a dangerous trigger. On one fateful day in 65 AD, what should have been a typical domestic argument turned into a horrifying tragedy. The details are murky, with ancient sources offering different versions of what occurred. Some historians suggest that Nero returned late from a chariot race. Others point to an argument over his theatrical endeavors. Regardless of the cause, the argument escalated quickly, reaching a point where Poppia, who was pregnant with their second child, dared to criticize Nero's priorities. She suggested that Nero cared more about his public image than his duties as a husband and father, a remark that struck at the core of Nero's insecurities. In a rage that would forever stain his reign, Nero struck Poppia. Some sources claim it was a single, brutal blow to her abdomen. Others suggest it was a prolonged attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the cold marble floors. What followed was nothing short of tragic. Nero, upon realizing the extent of his violence, reportedly fell to the floor beside Poppia, alternately begging for her forgiveness and ordering her to live. His behavior became erratic as he tried desperately to reverse the irreversible. He called for the best physicians in Rome, offering them fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppia died within hours, and with her, the unborn child she carried. For Nero, this moment represented more than the loss of a wife. It was the destruction of the one person he had obsessed over. Ancient sources describe his mourning as nothing short of pathological. He refused to allow her body to be burned in accordance with Roman custom. Instead, he had her embalmed and placed in a tomb far more elaborate than any previous emperor's burial. Nero's grief didn't stop there. He declared Poppia divine, as though her death had not only deprived him of a wife but robbed him of a part of his own identity. He set up a cult in her honor, and for days he would speak to her corpse, as if believing that somehow through his devotion he could revive her spirit. The imperial court, trapped in this bizarre mourning, had no choice but to play along, referring to Poppia in the present tense and keeping her seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested that Nero should move on was immediately exiled or worse. In this vulnerable state, a new figure emerged into Nero's life. It was during this dark and unstable period of mourning that Nero first laid eyes on Sporus, a young man who had been raised in the imperial household. Sporus was a freed slave, a position of relative privilege, but one that still left him entirely at the mercy of the emperor's favor. He had been educated in the palace, trained for administrative duties, and lived a life that, though far from luxurious, granted him some semblance of respect in the imperial court. However, it wasn't Sporus's intelligence or his administrative skills that caught Nero's attention. It was his face. Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppia, especially around the eyes and delicate bone structure. In the mind of Nero, this resemblance would have been almost supernatural, a sign that the gods had brought Sporus into his life to replace the wife he had lost. It's said that the first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppia's death, something snapped in his already fragile mind. To him, this young man was no longer just a boy from the palace. He was a manifestation of Poppia's spirit returned. The resemblance was so striking that Nero might have truly believed that fate had intervened, bringing back his beloved wife. But there was a problem: Sporus was male. In Nero's mind, however, this was merely a minor obstacle. He had already convinced himself that his grief could transcend any rational boundaries. So the idea of transforming a young man into the image of his lost wife did not seem out of the question. After all, in a world where an emperor was seen as a god, what was the transformation of one person into another compared to the vast power he held? Nero's obsession quickly spiraled from grief into something darker and more twisted. Sporus, who had been raised within the palace, had no way of escaping the emperor's desires. His fate, from the moment Nero had seen him, was sealed. But what followed was far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Nero didn't merely want Sporus to dress as a woman. He sought to erase the very essence of who Sporus was. The emperor ordered that Sporus undergo a horrific, life-altering transformation. What Nero had planned for Sporus was not simply an act of dressing up. It was an all-encompassing transformation, one that would change Sporus physically, psychologically, and socially. The emperor, consumed by his obsession with recreating Poppia, summoned the finest physicians in Rome. They were tasked with performing a dangerous and irreversible procedure on Sporus, one that would ensure he would physically resemble a woman, just as Nero believed his lost wife had. The psychological toll on Sporus must have been unimaginable. Every cut, every incision, was a violation not just of his body but of his very soul. He was forced into a new identity, a role he did not choose, one that he could not escape. The man who had once been a slave, freed and raised in the emperor's household, was now a living canvas for Nero's delusional grief. He had lost his humanity in the process, transformed into an object designed to soothe Nero's fractured mind. But even this horrific procedure wasn't enough for Nero. He had already decided that Sporus would become more than just a woman. He would become a perfect replica of Poppia, down to every detail. In Nero's mind, this transformation wasn't just physical, it was a resurrection of his dead wife. He was determined to have his lost love back, no matter the cost to Sporus's well-being. After recovering from the surgery, Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after Poppia. His identity was now completely erased, as if he had never existed as Sporus at all. He was reborn as the idealized version of the woman Nero had lost. And it was now time for the final act in Nero's twisted plan, the marriage. The transformation of Sporus into Sabina marked a dark turning point, but it wasn't complete until Nero decided to marry him in a grand imperial ceremony. This wasn't just any wedding, it was an extravagant spectacle meant to solidify Sporus's new identity as Nero's wife. The wedding would serve not only as a public act of devotion but as an opportunity for Nero to display his complete control over the young man who had been transformed to serve as his dead wife's replacement. The preparations for the wedding were nothing short of lavish. Nero spared no expense, turning the event into one of the most opulent displays of wealth and power that Rome had ever seen. The palace hall was transformed, adorned with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps, while musicians played traditional wedding songs. Servants offered the finest wines and delicacies, ensuring that everything about the event screamed imperial grandeur. To those who attended the ceremony, it might have appeared to be just another imperial wedding, a union of the emperor and his new empress. But to those who knew the truth, it was a grotesque performance that bordered on madness. Sporus, dressed in elaborate feminine garments, stood beside Nero, but instead of a joyful bride, he was a puppet forced into a role he didn't choose and couldn't escape. The guests, fully aware of the emperor's obsession, must have found the atmosphere thick with unease. There were probably some who, out of fear, congratulated the emperor on his new empress, but the entire situation was chilling. No one could say a word against the emperor, but beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of horror. It was a marriage that was as much about power as it was about control. And Sporus was nothing more than a living doll in Nero's twisted fantasy. The ceremony itself included all the traditional Roman wedding rituals: the exchange of vows, the joining of hands, the sharing of sacred bread. Everything was done according to custom, making the union official in the eyes of the Roman state. But for those who knew what had happened to Sporus, the ceremony was a horrific mockery of tradition, a symbol of the emperor's unhinged obsession. In the aftermath of the wedding, Sporus's life became a cruel performance. Nero treated him as if he were a legitimate empress, confining Sporus to the role of the devoted wife. The young man was given his own household staff, lavish quarters within the palace, and a generous income from the imperial treasury. He even had his own litter to travel in and horses for riding, luxuries that only heightened the sense of imprisonment. But all of these apparent privileges came at a terrible cost. Sporus had to constantly perform. He was expected to attend public functions with Nero, sit by his side at state dinners, and act as the perfect empress in every interaction. It wasn't enough for Nero to call Sporus by Poppia's name. He also expected Sporus to live out a completely fabricated version of Poppia's life. This was no longer just a marriage, it was an elaborate and relentless act of role-playing, one where the slightest mistake could mean the emperor's wrath. The pressure must have been unbearable for Sporus, who was forced to suppress his own identity and become someone he wasn't. But the most haunting aspect of this union was not the lavish surroundings or the public displays of affection. It was the fact that Sporus had no agency in this role. He was a tool, a means to an end for the emperor's delusional need for control. Nero had essentially created a world where Sporus could never escape, a world in which his only purpose was to serve as a replacement for a woman who was gone forever. It was the ultimate erasure of Sporus's identity, and it was a fate that would haunt him for the rest of his life. After the royal wedding, Sporus's existence was no longer his own. Every day was a performance, a carefully orchestrated act designed to maintain the fiction that he was the reincarnation of Poppia. Nero's obsession had transcended grief. It had become a complete erasure of Sporus's identity. The young man had been stripped of his past, his autonomy, and his future. In the eyes of the emperor, he was no longer Sporus, he was Sabina, a living embodiment of the wife Nero could not let go. The demands on Sporus were relentless. He was expected to participate in Nero's public life, to accompany him to banquets, public functions, and ceremonial events. Each moment spent in the emperor's presence was another step in his forced transformation. His every move, every glance, was scrutinized. Nero expected Sporus to embody the image of Poppia at all times. Even the slightest deviation from the role could lead to punishment, for Nero had become not just a lover, but a tyrant demanding perfection from his wife. But the life of luxury that came with this position was hollow. Sporus had a grand palace to live in, servants to attend to his every need, and the finest clothes and jewels at his disposal. He was treated as though he were an empress, but this lavishness was a gilded cage. The trappings of power and wealth couldn't mask the fact that Sporus was still a prisoner to Nero's twisted obsession. The most cruel part of this existence wasn't just the role he was forced to play, but the psychological toll it took on him. Sporus was not only physically transformed to resemble Poppia, but he was also taught to act, speak, and move as if he were her. Nero's courtiers, likely under duress, taught Sporus how to sit, how to stand, how to move through space with grace. He was instructed in feminine behaviors, how to speak in a higher tone, how to gesture in ways considered ladylike in Roman society. These lessons were grueling. Sporus's every action was scrutinized, his every word carefully measured. There were no moments of reprieve, no opportunities to be himself. Even the reflection he saw in the mirror was not his own. Every day he was forced to confront the face of a woman who was not his own, an identity that had been violently imposed upon him. And yet, despite the trauma and the degradation, Sporus complied. He learned to anticipate Nero's moods, to respond with the right level of affection, to act as though he truly were Poppia in public. Sporus was perfect. He played the role of the loving empress with remarkable skill, earning praise from the courtiers and applause from the public. But behind the scenes, the toll of this charade was devastating. Sporus became increasingly withdrawn, melancholic and withdrawn, though he never faltered in his role. The physical and emotional strain of living this lie was immense, but there was no escape. Sporus was entirely dependent on Nero's favor. To break character, to speak out against the emperor, was unthinkable. It would mean certain death. So Sporus continued to play the part, year after year, hiding the true extent of his suffering behind a mask of feminine grace. But for all the luxury and privilege that came with his position, Sporus knew he was not free. He was an object, a symbol of Nero's obsession, and his life was not his own. This existence, one of constant performance, was a far cry from the hopes and dreams he might have had for his future. Those aspirations, like his original identity, were long gone. What remained was a man whose life had been reshaped by the will of a tyrant, and the years that followed would prove to be just as devastating for Sporus. Nero's obsession with Sporus reached new heights in 67 AD when he decided to take his new wife on a grand tour of Greece. To Nero, this was not just a political tour, it was an opportunity to showcase his artistic talents and, in his mind, further prove his divine brilliance. As a self-proclaimed artist, Nero fancied himself a star on the world stage, and Greece, the cradle of classical art and culture, was the perfect backdrop for his ego-driven performances. But what made this tour truly horrific was Sporus's role in it. Nero, still convinced that Sporus was the reincarnation of his beloved Poppia, insisted on bringing him along as the Empress of Rome. Imagine the confusion and disbelief of Greek aristocrats and foreign dignitaries as they witnessed a teenage boy dressed as a woman forced to play the role of the Empress. As Nero insisted everyone treat the clearly false image as reality, Sporus was paraded through the cities of Greece as Nero's wife. To outsiders, it must have been a strange spectacle, but to Nero, it was an essential part of his delusion. He treated Sporus like a legitimate empress, displaying him at public functions and making him a part of every ceremony and celebration. For Sporus, however, this tour was a public humiliation on an unimaginable scale. The Greek aristocrats, who were renowned for their cultural sophistication, must have found it difficult to reconcile the emperor's grandiose performances with the bizarre reality they saw before them. But, as with everything under Nero's reign, no one dared speak the truth. Sporus had become nothing more than a living ornament, a piece of property to be shown off at Nero's whim. The young man was forced to smile, to act, and to play the part of a woman who was dead while the world watched. It is difficult to imagine the emotional toll on Sporus during this time. Forced to perform constantly, he became more isolated and alienated from himself. The person he once was, the young boy who had walked freely through the palace as a servant, was now gone. In his place stood an emperor's creation, an object to be displayed, manipulated, and forced into a role he had never chosen. This Greek tour, however, marked a key moment in the tragic saga of Sporus's life. The horror of it would be something he could never escape. By 68 AD, Nero's excesses had pushed the Roman Empire to the brink. What began as a reign full of promise and intrigue had descended into tyranny, corruption, and madness. The Senate, the military, and the people could no longer tolerate Nero's erratic behavior and neglect of his imperial duties. Rebellions broke out across the empire, and the once celebrated emperor found himself isolated, betrayed by the very institutions that had once adored him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite force sworn to protect the emperor, declared their opposition to Nero's rule. Rebellions led by powerful governors surged, and even his most loyal supporters turned against him. Nero, always the dramatist, fled Rome, hoping for a miraculous escape, but no one came to his aid. His reign, once filled with grandeur and artistic pretensions, had crumbled to nothing more than a tragic spectacle. As Nero fled, Sporus's fate grew more uncertain. Throughout Nero's reign, the young man had been little more than a living replacement for a dead wife, a symbol of the emperor's unhinged obsession. But with Nero's downfall, Sporus was left vulnerable. His identity had been so thoroughly erased that he was now nothing more than a pawn in the chaotic aftermath of Nero's reign. Sporus was one of the few who followed Nero into exile. The emperor, refusing to part with his wife, kept Sporus by his side, even as his empire collapsed around him. They found refuge in a villa outside Rome where they waited for either rescue or capture. Nero, still convinced that his fall from grace was temporary, began to plot his next move, all while keeping Sporus as a reminder of the life he had lost. But Nero's plans quickly fell apart. His enemies closed in on him, and the inevitable happened. Nero chose suicide over capture, as he believed it would preserve his dignity. The emperor, who once had the world at his feet, now lay dead, his life snuffed out in an act of cowardice. Yet for Sporus, the end of Nero's reign was far from a reprieve. In the chaotic power struggle that followed Nero's death, Sporus, who had been little more than an object to Nero, was now seen as a symbol of the fallen emperor's decadence. He was captured and passed from one new ruler to another, each treating him as nothing more than a possession to be used for their own political or sexual pleasure. Sporus had become a pawn in the ever-shifting game of power, his original identity lost to history, his autonomy forever gone. Sporus's fate was sealed by the cruel whims of the powerful men who came after Nero. He was taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, a man who, like Nero, sought to use Sporus as a tool for his own desires. Then, he passed to Otho and later, to Vitellius, each emperor treating him as a mere object of sexual or political gain. For these men, Sporus was a symbol of Nero's excess, a tragic trophy to be used and discarded at will. The final chapter of Sporus's tragic life was not one of freedom or redemption. Instead, it was one of profound degradation. Under Emperor Vitellius, Sporus's nightmare reached its cruelest conclusion. Vitellius, eager to prove his own power and solidify his position, decided to use Sporus for public entertainment in the grand amphitheater of the Colosseum. It wasn't enough for Sporus to be paraded around as a symbol of Nero's excess. Now, he was to be humiliated in front of thousands of spectators in a grotesque reenactment of mythological scenes. This was the ultimate degradation. Sporus, already stripped of his identity, forced to live a life dictated by the whims of emperors, was now being used for the amusement of the Roman populace. His body, transformed into the image of a woman he was not, was paraded as a mockery of what it once had been. The Colosseum, the site of countless gladiatorial games, was now the stage for his final humiliation. His body became a spectacle, a tool for the Roman elite to demonstrate their complete control over the lives of those beneath them. But Sporus, unlike the others who had been humiliated before him, chose to make his own final decision. Perhaps, after all the years of forced submission and psychological torment, there was still a flicker of the young man who had once walked freely through the palace. With no hope of escape from his tormentors, Sporus took matters into his own hands. He chose death over further humiliation, likely by poison, the only means of escape left to him. Sporus died sometime in 69 AD, probably no older than 20. His death was a tragic end to a life that had been brutalized from a young age. The boy who had been forced to live as a woman, who had been robbed of his identity, his dignity, and his humanity, had finally reclaimed one thing: his power to choose his own fate. In death, Sporus was freed from the role that had consumed him, the grotesque performance he had been forced to live. His story, tragic and horrifying, was largely forgotten by history, eclipsed by the grand narratives of imperial power and political maneuvering. Yet it speaks to something deeper: the human cost of unchecked power, the psychological and physical toll of living under the complete control of another, and the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of total destruction. Sporus's story remains a haunting reminder that behind the grandeur of imperial Rome and the flashy tales of emperors and conquests, there were real people, victims of the twisted desires of the powerful. His death, a final act of defiance, was both a tragedy and a statement. Even when everything else is taken from you, the ability to choose your own death remains one of the last freedoms. This story is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the human cost of absolute power and imperial excess. In the shadow of Nero's empire, Sporus became more than just a victim. He became a symbol of the cruelty that lurked beneath Rome's grandeur, and his death, though tragic, was a final tragic act of reclaiming some measure of control in a world that had robbed him of everything else.